thank you. Thanks for organizing, Jorge, Richard. This is a really fantastic gathering. The schedule looks amazing. And I'm really excited to be here to talk about this project, which is joint with Wyatt Clarke, who's a recent PhD graduate of UC Irvine and now at IBM. So just a little preface for this. This project is both old and new. Old in the sense that, in fact, I had the idea for this project many years ago now. I'm embarrassed to admit it's been like 6 or 7 years ago that I originally started thinking about this project. But because of various data constraints and issues that I ran into along the way, I had shelved it for some period of time until Wyatt came along. He was also interested in housing issues. We sort of jump-started the project at that point. So a lot of the results that you'll see today are, in fact, quite new. And so, of course, I'm eager to get feedback on the project as a whole and maybe different directions that we could take it. OK. So just to get started, just by way of motivation, governments around the world often intervene to try to encourage private residential investment in blighted neighborhoods. So these programs, especially in the US, are often touted as being market-based in the sense that, unlike federal public housing programs of 60, 70 years ago, they don't involve the government directly stepping in to build new housing. Rather, these programs tend to provide grants, loans, or tax credits to private homeowners or developers to try to encourage housing construction, maintenance, or renovation projects. Now, the rationale behind these programs is typically that dilapidated, abandoned, vacant properties could impose important negative externalities on nearby property owners, and that fresh investment that replaces these properties with new or rehabilitated homes could therefore have substantial positive spillovers within neighborhoods. So these spillovers could be purely in the form of kind of an amenity effect, that is replacing a vacant lot or abandoned building with a new shiny house could improve the perceived, if not the actual, quality of the neighborhood and thereby boost home values. It's also possible that new construction or rehabilitation of one property could have direct effects on neighbors' investment behavior through form of kind of peer effects. If I see my neighbor build a new porch, right, it might prompt me to build a new porch as well. Of course, the key concern, though, with these types of programs is that program funds could merely displace or crowd out unsubsidized private investment in the housing stock. That is to say, some or even all the investments subsidized by the government might have happened even in the absence of any subsidy, in which case these programs are really just acting as a pure transfer from the government, i.e. taxpayers, to a select set of private developers or homeowners who are lucky enough to receive these incentives. So if that's true, that is, if many inframarginal projects end up receiving government funds, it's likely that the money allocated to these programs could be better used elsewhere. So that brings me to the big questions of this paper, which are first, how big are the crowd-out effects associated with these types of programs? Is it true, in other words, that some or even all the investment subsidized by the government would have happened even in the absence of the subsidies? And second, to the extent that it's not all inframarginal, are there any external benefits or spillovers associated with program-induced investment? And if so, what are the mechanisms behind these spillovers? So to address these questions, we examine the impacts of one large state housing construction and rehabilitation program, Missouri's Neighborhood Preservation Act, or NPA, in the city of St. Louis. So the NPA offers tax credits to homeowners and developers that improve or expand the owner-occupied housing stock in low-income parts of the state. But because there's a limit on the amount of tax credits that can be awarded each year, the state uses a lottery to determine which applicants actually receive these tax credits. Right, so taking advantage of the random assignment of these NPA tax credits, together with detailed property-level data, we explore the degree of crowd-out, as well as the nature and extent of spillovers associated with investment under the program. So just kind of a preview of our sort of preliminary findings. First, we find evidence of substantial, but not complete crowd-out of unsubsidized private investment in the owner-occupied housing stock. Right, so specifically, we find that winning applicants, what we refer to as approved projects, are issued more building permits on average than losing applicants, what we refer to as denied projects, suggesting that the program is inducing at least some housing investment over and above what would have happened in the program's absence. That being said, though, denied applicants are issued substantially more building permits, in fact, several times more building permits than the sort of typical property in St. Louis, which implies that a lot of these projects are going to proceed regardless of whether they actually win the tax credits. Also, using data from the city's assessment office, we find that each NPA dollar authorized increases home values by somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 cents. For reasons you'll see later, I don't want to push this exact number too hard. But nonetheless, the sort of assessment and house price data suggests that the program is inducing at least some housing construction and rehabilitation over and above what would have happened otherwise. In terms of the externalities associated with this housing investment, we find evidence of positive but very, very limited externalities. In particular, we find that a slight effect of NPA subsidized investment at one property on the likelihood that owners of neighboring properties are issued more building permits as well. Right? But the effects are very small and are largely confined to properties immediately adjacent to those that receive these tax credits. Right? Also, we find effects on nearby property values that are slightly larger, perhaps in geographic scope, right? But they're still quite small and fade away fairly quickly within about 100 feet or so of the property in question. So we interpret these results as suggesting that there are some roles for both neighborhood interactions and renovation decisions, as well as kind of broader amenity effects in giving rise to housing externalities, right? But overall, the externalities are very, very small. Okay? So a few key takeaways, just in case we don't get quite through everything. So while it's clearly the case that many projects are inframarginal, would have happened even in the absence of the program, programs like the NPA can induce at least some housing investment that wouldn't have happened otherwise. But the external effects of this investment are both smaller and much more limited in geographic scope than a lot of past studies on these types of programs would suggest. Also, kind of contrary to what a lot of proponents of the NPA and proponents of programs like it often argue, the program is very far from paying for itself in any sense by increasing property values and thereby property tax revenues enough to offset the cost of running the program. So even if we're quite generous to the program in terms of interpreting our estimates, just to give you some flavor of this, assuming a discount rate of 2%, it would take close to a century for the implied increases in property tax revenues resulting from a program investment to cover the costs of running this program in St. Louis for just 1 year. Okay. Also, and you might have been able to guess this based on what I've already told you, if we don't take advantage of the experimental variation afforded to us by the NPA's lottery and instead use a more traditional approach to estimating the program's impacts, in particular, match-treated properties, those that receive tax incentive to the universe of untreated properties in St. Louis, match them on observables and run kind of standard diff and diff type analysis, we end up massively overstating the program's effects, right? So much so, in fact, that we can actually make the program look pretty good in terms of cost effectiveness. Okay. So a little bit of background on these types of programs. So again, housing investment and rehabilitation programs here in the US exist at all levels of government, federal, state, and local levels. There's been a number of papers on these programs, most of which find at least some evidence that subsidized housing investment has some positive impacts on neighborhoods. A lot of this literature is focused on federal programs, most notably low-income housing tax credit. And many of these papers have found evidence of at least modest, in some cases fairly sizable, positive impacts of subsidized, in this case, rental housing development, particularly in lower income neighborhoods. There's a smaller number of papers looking at the impacts of state and local programs aimed at encouraging housing development, again, typically in blighted neighborhoods, programs in Minneapolis, New York City, Virginia, and elsewhere, that also suggest, again, that these types of programs can have at least some positive impacts on neighborhoods. Just because they have positive impacts on neighborhoods certainly doesn't make the programs worthwhile necessarily. And indeed, there's a kind of a mounting literature that these programs are associated with a lot of crowd out of unsubsidized private investment. Right? That is to say, many people end up receiving subsidies for doing what they would have done anyway. There's also a lot of evidence of what I think of as kind of less extreme forms of crowd out. Specifically, that some of these programs may just be shifting in space where projects happen, from neighborhoods where they're not eligible to receive tax incentives, say, to neighborhoods where they are, or maybe shifting forward in times projects that would have otherwise happened in the future, but not increasing the aggregate housing stock in kind of the medium to long run. Okay. So to the extent that there are externalities associated with housing investment, sorry. Sure.
One thing that, maybe you'll get to this later, the context seems to matter a lot here. In St. Louis, it's a city that's been in serious decline for 100 years now.
Yep.
So if you were to look at a blighted neighborhood, and it doesn't have to be Austin, but a blighted neighborhood and a just city that's been doing okay.
I'll have a little bit to say about this.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
So there is some variation in St. Louis that we can exploit to try to address this question at least a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
OK, so to the extent that there are externalities associated with housing investment, what might be the mechanisms? Well, one possibility is that investment at one property might have direct effects on neighbors' investment behavior. And indeed, there's a few papers now that suggest that people are, in fact, responsive to their neighbors' renovation activity. And one could tell a few stories as to why this might be the case, right? The kind of sexier story is that a kind of a behavioral story of keeping up with the Joneses, right? Another story, a little bit more mundane, is that you kind of get information from your neighbor about good contractors, about the city permitting process, about the property value implications of different renovations you might do, and that might lead to this spatial correlation in renovation activity as well. Another possibility is that they're just kind of broader amenity effects. So again, many of these programs are ostensibly targeted at blighted neighborhoods, where often there are a lot of vacant lots, abandoned buildings, dilapidated structures, places where garbage collects, people loiter, raccoons live, right, that kind of thing. Presumably, these places are kind of represent disamenities, dragging down nearby home values. And of course, if we can replace those properties with new houses, that might boost nearby home values. And again, if we kind of believe the proponents of these types of programs, they argue this will also help to attract new residents, new businesses, contribute to some broader neighborhood revitalization. OK, so on to the NPA, the Neighborhood Preservation Act. So again, this is a program in Missouri. Its primary goal, stated goal, is to protect against neighborhood deterioration in the state's poorest communities. It was passed in 1999. It went into effect in 2000. And it authorizes the use of tax credits to offset part of the cost of investment in maintenance, repairs, or new construction of specifically owner-occupied housing. Okay. Now, importantly, eligibility for these tax credits is based entirely on the location of the property. So unlike in some other programs like the NPA in other states, eligibility is not contingent on being listed on some historic site registry or on the income of the taxpayer. All that matters is that the property is located in what the state considers to be a distressed or qualified community, and in which case, if you're there, you're eligible for these tax credits. So we're going to focus in on the city of St. Louis, which is in its entirety considered a distressed community, where in fact all properties are eligible to apply for these tax credits. Okay? So how does the credit lottery work? Well, in fact, it's quite simple. So the NPA authorizes $8 million a year for qualifying areas statewide. So every year since the program has been in existence, since 2000, demand for these tax credits has far, far outstripped supply, even through the recession. So by law, in order to disperse the funds, Missouri's Department of Economic Development has to use a lottery. The way it works is applications are due in February. They collect all these applications, put them in an Excel spreadsheet, assign a random number to each application, conditional on it meeting eligibility requirements, that they've coming from an eligible area, and they're applying for an eligible expense, which I can talk about later if people are interested. Right? Then they rank the applications based on this random number, and then simply work down the list, awarding tax credits to people until they run out of money. Right? That's all there is to it. Okay. So this turned out to be a very useful setting to examine the impacts of these tax incentives on housing investment, because here credits, of course, are not being allocated to projects that program officers think might have the highest likelihood of success or potentially the greatest social benefit. Rather, the credits are just being randomly assigned to applicants, such that projects that are turned down for tax credits provide a suitable control group for projects that win them. So the approach here is going to contrast sharply with past research on these types of programs, which again has typically relied on sort of diff and diff type designs, where you compare a treated property or treated neighborhood to a similar looking control property or control neighborhood. Right? Of course, in that context, the concern is that the treatment itself is endogenous to outcomes that you might be interested in. So for example, if tax credits are awarded disproportionately in areas with better future prospects, we're going to end up overstating not just the direct effects of the tax incentives for the properties that receive them, but also spillover effects as well, to the extent that the entire neighborhood might be on the upswing. OK, so our data primarily come from Missouri's Department of Economic Development. So it was actually a breeze with a FOIA request to get information on all the approved applicants under the NPA. So I have, of course, when they applied, what year, the address of the property, the total amount of credits authorized, the total amount that they actually claimed, and then some limited information about kind of the project type. It was much harder to get information on denied applicants. And in fact, for many years, I fought with the lawyers in Missouri trying to get information on denied applicants. The lawyers took the stance that because these people never actually got money from the state, they were not at liberty to provide me information about these denied applicants. So I had to slowly narrow my request down. Ultimately, what I have on denied applicants is just the year that they applied and their address, so the location of the property. So this is going to limit some of the kind of tests for heterogeneity you might have in mind that I could potentially do. In the future, hopefully, we'll be able to get more information on these denied applicants. Another limitation is that currently I only have data up through 2010. Again, I'm hoping to get more data. They've kind of promised me more data beyond 2010. They're cleaning it up, but they've been cleaning it up for a number of months now. And so we're only going to use data up through 2010. I'm also going to restrict attention to the 2003 to 2010 period because they have very poor record keeping prior to 2003, and that complicates interpretation of what's going on. So as I mentioned, we're going to focus on the city of St. Louis. Of course, the first step was just matching the applicants to parcel identifiers using some city-provided assessment records. With these parcel identifiers, then we can link the properties to lots of other detailed property-level data, including data from the building division, as well as the assessor's office and more. OK, so here's just a snapshot of the NPA winners during the 2003 to 2010 period. So during this period, there were 286 winners, winning properties. The average credit authorized was close to $36,000. So these are very sizable credits. The fraction that had been claimed by 2011, so you have 2 years after you win the tax credit to actually claim the tax credit. Right? So I'm using 2011 since the last year of our sample is 2010. So the fraction that claimed their tax credits by 2011 was about 3/4. And the average credit that was actually issued was about $22,000, right? So when you claim your tax credit, you're claiming it on your state income taxes, and you have to supply receipts and so on. And so the average amount issued is actually lower than what's authorized to people. So here's a picture of the city of St. Louis. So if you're not familiar with the city, it's this teardrop-shaped city. Running on the right side is the Mississippi River, and in the left is the rest of the beautiful state of Missouri. The lines here just delineate the 79 neighborhoods in the city-defined neighborhoods. And of course, these dots just represent applicants during this 2003 to 2010 period. So there are close to 4,000 applicants over this 2003 to 2010 period. You can see they're scattered, of course, throughout the city. There's a few big exceptions, right? So there's this big block here. Anybody from St. Louis? This is a big park. It's called Forest Park. So obviously no residences in there. And then running down the Mississippi River, there's a lot of kind of industrial area. And so there's fewer applications coming from there naturally as well. The kind of biggest concentrations of applicants are coming from just south of downtown. So this is our kind of a bigger residential area. Again, if you're familiar with the city, this is like Lafayette Square, Benton Park, McKinley Heights neighborhoods, as well as west of downtown. So this is like Central West End, Hamilton Heights areas. Yeah?
Is that empty rectangle up there Pruitt-Igoe?
Yes, yes. I think so. You're really testing my knowledge of St. Louis.
Well,
but
I believe
so.
It's so dead that they can't even get an application.
Yeah. I mean, it's pretty bombed out up there. Yeah, there's not much going on, and I think that's true for a lot of this area right up here. Yep. So again, of those 4,000, only 286 actually won the lottery during this my sample period. So these are the winners. The darker dots are the winners of the lottery. So you can see a couple of things. One, there's a lot fewer of them, of course, than total applicants. But two, they're kind of distributed in much the same way around the city as all applicants. And then, of course, 3/4 of these approved guys actually claimed the tax credit. And so these are the ones that actually claimed a tax credit. So one last thing, kind of before I move on from the maps, going kind of to Richard's point. St. Louis was deemed by the state to be an entirely distressed community. But for anybody who's been to St. Louis, you probably know it's not uniformly terrible in St. Louis. And indeed, there's quite a bit of heterogeneity across neighborhoods in the city. Right? So there's some neighborhoods, particularly kind of Central West End areas. They're in fact quite nice. There's really big houses, big yards. They're very well maintained by St. Louis, maybe not by LA, but by St. Louis standards, quite expensive. OK, yeah, so there's some neighborhoods that are quite nice, like Central West End. But literally, a stone's throw away, there are neighborhoods that are quite bad, right? So places like the Ville, where it's actually quite shocking. I took a bike ride around the Ville. Not the best idea, but took a bike ride. It's quite shocking how much vacant land there is kind of in a city. And a lot of completely dilapidated structures, boarded up houses, and so on, right? So really bad conditions, okay? So of course, we can use some of this variation across neighborhoods to think about differential treatment effects depending on kind of initial conditions of these neighborhoods. Okay. So the next thing we do is to match the applicants to block-level demographic and housing characteristics from the 2000 decennial census. So we have a bunch of demographic and housing characteristics of the blocks on which these applicants are located. So we're going to use this information first just to kind of test whether the block characteristics are balanced across approved and denied applicants. test for whether the randomization worked. And then later we'll throw these in as controls in some of the regressions just to help with precision as well. Okay. So here are the average block characteristics, again, of the blocks from which approved and denied applicants come. Okay. So the typical block on which an applicant is located has about 45 housing units on it. Close to a fourth are vacant. About 45% are owner-occupied. There's about 85 people, and so on. So you can see that in general, they're quite similar. The only statistically significant difference across these two columns is for share owner-occupied, which is slightly higher for approved applicants than denied applicants. But again, it's not super big, so not too worried about it. I also have down here at the bottom the assessed value, so what the city assigned the market value of these houses to be for approved and denied applicants. Right? Again, very similar. You'll notice these are very low. There's lots of issues wrapped up in the assessment data that, again, we could talk about later if you like. But for now, just wanted to verify like they look similar at the outset. OK, so the next thing we do, getting on to the actual outcomes, is we match the applicants to building permit data from the building division of the city of St. Louis. So we have building permit data broken out by permit type. What I'm going to show you, though, is just actual building permits. So these are permits for new construction and structural alterations for which we have really clean data over our full sample period and beyond. For a subset of years, we also have data for lots of other types of permits: demolition permits, occupancy permits, electrical, mechanical, plumbing permits, and permit waivers. I won't show you those unless you want to see them, but they kind of qualitatively look really similar to what we see for overall building permit issuance. Okay? So just to give you a baseline to think about as we get into the results, properties in St. Louis on average apply for about 0.04 building permits every year, so about one building permit every 25 years or so. Right? And so that's kind of a useful benchmark to think about now as we turn to how many building permits participants in this lottery are issued. Right, so here are the results summarized graphically. So what I'm showing you here is the average number of building permits issued to approved applicants, the darker bars, and denied applicants, the lighter bars, in different windows of time after they applied for the building permits. The year of the application itself, the 2-year window that they technically have to complete the project, a 3-year window, a 4-year window, and 5-year window. So mechanically, of course, these are going up. Right? So first thing to note is that denied applicants in the year of the application alone are issued about 0.35 building permits. So this is like 7 times as many building permits in the year of the application, kind of a typical property in St. Louis. So this is kind of a first indication that many people who are applying to the lottery are going to proceed with their planned construction regardless of whether or not they actually win these tax credits. That being said, right, approved applicants are issued more building permits, statistically significantly more, about 0.6 building permits in the year of the application alone. Right? If we expand things to 2 years, right, we see that the gap between approved and denied remains. And in fact, in this 2-year window, approved applicants apply for like about 63% more building permits than denied applicants. One other kind of interesting thing is that as we expand the window of time more, it can include 3 years, 4 years, and 5 years, right, the gap between approved and denied remains. If anything, gets a little bit bigger. Right? And so this suggests to me that the program isn't merely shifting forward in time projects that would have otherwise happened a few years down the line. Because if that were the case, of course, these bars would be getting closer together over time. So here are the results in regression form. So here I'm just running number of permits issued in different windows on whether or not you won the lottery or not. Again, not whether or not you claimed a credit, but whether you won. In the first column, it's just that kind of univariate regression. So these are kind of the same differences that I just showed you in the graph. And then I throw in kind of year of the application or year of the lottery, and then some other controls for like the block on which the applicant is located. And so you can see the results are really robust across these different specifications. Okay. So one other thing, just using kind of the heterogeneity across neighborhoods. And so what I've done here is basically taken the difference between the average number of permits issued to approved applicants and denied applicants by neighborhood, right, and plotted that against the percent change in neighborhood population between 2000 and 2010, kind of a measure of gentrification or growth across neighborhoods. The results actually don't look all that different if you just put share black in 2000 on this x-axis as well. And so what do you see here? Well, you see that in kind of faster growing neighborhoods like downtown West. So downtown West was kind of actually the one part of St. Louis that was really gentrifying in a serious way in the 2000s. We seem to see kind of a smaller, in fact, kind of negative effect of the program. Specifically, denied applicants on average are being issued more building permits than approved applicants in downtown West, although this is not a statistically significant result. Right? As we look at kind of declining or stable neighborhoods, though, right, we see bigger kind of positive effects of the program, that approved applicants are, in fact, being issued substantially more building permits than denied applicants. So this is consistent with a lot of past research on these types of programs that just suggests, kind of to Richard's point as well, that you're kind of getting more bang for your buck in stable or declining neighborhoods with these programs relative to fast-growing neighborhoods. And I think that's kind of in line with our intuition as well, as where these programs will work. So to Larry's point, right? So permits are nice in that they are easily observed and measured, likely capture a lot of construction rehab activity that we think might be important, especially for property values. They're also nice in that it's a kind of an observable measure of actual investment behavior, right? But you might be concerned that permits are going to miss some projects. That's not necessarily problematic for us in and of itself. It's only really problematic if the propensity to get a permit is related to whether you won the lottery. And I think it's quite plausible that would be the case, right? You feel like the government's watching you once you've won the lottery, and if you're going to claim the credits, you want to do it all on the up and up. And so we might expect some differential propensity to actually get permits for a given project. Right? So for that reason, and many others, we also want to look at the effects of these tax credits on actual property values. Of course, this helps to address this broader question of to what extent the tax credits are being kind of capitalized into home values. Right? Also, it's going to, of course, when we think about spillover effects in a couple minutes, we can, of course, the house values are going to reflect not just any new investment that people are making, but also these kind of amenity effects that might arise from the removal of disamenities associated with this program. And then, of course, also changes in property values have implications for tax revenues. And so we could think about to what extent increases in tax revenues might be offsetting the cost of this program. Property value data, we have assessment data. These are pretty standard looking assessment data for anybody who's dealt with them. I have standard assessment data advantages, namely that they're universal, but also disadvantages and that the city sometimes gets it wrong, of course. The nice thing, though, is that with the assessment data, even if they're getting the market values wrong, for tax liability reason, or for what determining tax liability, it's what the assessor's office thinks your market value is, not what it actually is. So at least we can kind of pin down changes in tax revenues, even if we can't get the market value effects exactly right with the assessment data. We also have sales data from the city as well. So we're going to look at outcomes, including whether or not winning the lottery changes the probability that a house changes hands, as well as the actual sale price when it changes hands. Okay, so here, kind of being sensitive to time at this point. All right, so here are the results for using assessed values, right, in levels. Right, so the assessed property value 2 years after you participate in the lottery, and then log assessed value. Right, and so you can see here that winning the lottery is associated with approximately $15,000 higher assessed value. Right, we don't have any stars here. That's why it's a little bit. It's kind of a little bit mushy result. If we log things, we get a few stars. These logged effects translate into slightly larger dollar amounts than these, but are kind of qualitatively similar. And so this is where I got the number at the beginning of the talk. Each NPA dollar authorizes increases home values by somewhere on the order of about 50 cents or so. If we use sales, right, so one kind of striking finding is that we find that winning the lottery is associated with a substantially higher probability that the house changes hands within 5 years, about 13 percentage point higher probability that it sells. This is on a base of about 38%, so a pretty sizable effect. As far as sales prices go, they look pretty similar to what we found with the assessment data as well. And then finally, we also do some heterogeneity of effects across neighborhoods. Here's for probability of sale and sale prices. And again, we find this downward sloping relationship. Again, I'm plotting here the percent change in neighborhood population. So again, it still seems like you get more bang for your buck in declining neighborhoods than in growth ones. OK, so I want to spend the last couple minutes talking about spillovers and then just summarizing. So of course, a key question is whether or not the program-induced investment has differential effects on neighbors' propensity to invest and neighbors' property values. So I'm going to do something absurdly simple here. We've tried to do some more sophisticated things that basically give us the same result. So I'll spare you that. But all I'm going to show you is permit issuance to properties in successive rings around approved applicants, and then permit issuance to properties in successive rings around denied applicants. So I'm going to compare those two and see whether or not it looks like properties around approved applicants are being issued more permits on average than properties around denied applicants, as well as whether property values changes differentially as too. Okay. So for this, I'm going to exclude parcels in these rings that also applied for NPA tax credits. I have some kind of conceptual reasons why I think this is probably appropriate, but the results are pretty similar, slightly larger in magnitude if we include all surrounding parcels. OK, so here are the results for permit issuance in these rings. So what I'm showing you is for a 2-year window and a 5-year window, the number of permits that are being issued to properties in these 50-foot successive rings around approved applicants, the darker bars, and then properties in these same rings around denied applicants, the lighter bars. And so what you can see, especially if you kind of squint and ignore the standard error bars, right, is that it looks like there's slightly more permits being issued to properties around approved applicants than denied applicants, out to maybe up to about 100 feet, which is about, a typical city block is about 300 feet long, just to give you some benchmark. And then that kind of goes away and then bounces around. Right, these aren't really, obviously, statistically significant for the 2-year window. Things look a little bit better for the 5-year window, where we see a slightly more pronounced difference between permit issuance to properties around approved relative to denied applicants. Again, out to about 100 feet. But then again, it kind of fades away and bounces around. So we take this as evidence that there seemed to be perhaps a small effect. I should mention these differences are very, very small relative to the direct effects that I mentioned earlier. Very small effects on potentially on neighbors' investment behavior, but they fade away pretty fast. They're pretty confined to properties very close to the approved applicant. Here are the results for property values. I'm just showing essentially the difference between those two bars in the previous graph, but for now logged assessed value. Right, and so what you can see again is that properties close to those that are approved that were approved, right, that won the tax credit, seem to be higher on average by about 5%, a little over 5% or so. But again, the effect is it's not a huge effect, and it fades away within about 100, 150 feet of the property in question, and then is 0 after that. Right? So again, quite small and geographically confined externalities. OK, so if we're kind of generous to the program and we include the impacts on recipient properties, as well as those within about 100 feet, the higher property values resulting from program-induced investment between 2003 and 2010 generate somewhere on the order of about $114,000 in additional tax revenues each year. So just to give you a sense of how big that number is, this is about 2% of what it costs to administer this program just in St. Louis in 1 year, in a kind of typical year. Another way to kind of reframe that, if we assume a discount rate of 2%, it would take about 90 years or so to recoup the cost of running this program in St. Louis for just 1 year. So very, very far from paying for itself in any sense. Also, I won't show you the results, but we could certainly talk about them. If we don't take advantage of the experimental variation we have with the lottery and instead kind of do a more traditional thing to try to estimate the program's impacts, match treated properties to untreated properties, unobservables, run kind of standard difference and differences, we end up overstating the program's effects. And it's a little bit disturbing how we can kind of cherry pick results or specifications to get the program to look better or worse as we choose. In fact, we can make the program look like it would pay for itself in a decade or so. OK, so just to summarize, we take advantage of the lottery structure of Missouri's MPA to examine the effects of tax incentives for housing investment in low-income areas. We find evidence of substantial but not complete crowd out. In particular, permit issuance and property value gains do seem to be larger among approved relative to denied projects. We also find some evidence of spillovers, including perhaps slight effects on neighbors' investment behavior, although it's, again, largely confined to properties immediately adjacent to those that win the lottery, and impacts on property values that are also, again, limited in geographic scope. So kind of the key takeaways, at least for me, these tax incentives for housing investment in low-income areas can have at least some measurable effects. There seem to be some roles for kind of direct effects on neighbors' investment behavior, as well as broader amenity effects in giving rise to housing externalities. But given the amount of crowd out that we see, as well as the limited scope of these spillovers, these types of production subsidies are likely to be fairly expensive and crude tools in pursuing neighborhood revitalization goals. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Right, so relative to sites that applied but did not win the lottery, approved sites that applied and did win were issued 0.4 more permits over a 2-year window, which is a 62% increase. And they also experienced somewhere in the range of a 30 to 40% appreciation in property values, depending on how you measure it. And sort of the summary conclusion for that is that for every $1 of tax credit which was issued through this program, 72 cents was capitalized directly into property values of the approved sites. And in terms of spillovers, they find some limited evidence of positive spillovers. They find that properties within 100 feet of approved sites apply for 0.1 more permits than properties within 100 feet of denied sites. And these properties also saw an 8% increase in their assessed property values. So to kind of just summarize what the main takeaways are, it seems like crowd out is not, there's limited evidence of crowd out, but it's not super large. But at the same time, the positive spillovers, which serve as the justification for these subsidies, also appear quite modest and highly localized. So I really liked reading this paper. It's a really, really great research design. It's very hard to argue with the causal validity of the estimates. And actually, that makes the role of a discussant hard, because what are you going to say? Small sample size may be an issue. As you saw, standard errors were quite large. In that sense, I will have something to say very briefly about that. But overall, you know, I see this as a pretty important contribution, especially in highlighting a source of causal variation to our understanding of spatial spillovers due to housing investments. And so my comments are mainly going to focus on just a few really minor concerns that I think you can deal with, and then maybe some discussion of potential further exploration or extensions of the work. So the first is, my first comment is about the covariate balance. It's very nice that at the neighborhood level, the covariates appear quite balanced. But I was concerned with this one line here, and I'm sorry if people can't see, but they're showing that for the denied applicants, the mean sales price prior to the year in which they applied was about $90,000, whereas for denied, it's about $80,000. That's almost a 10% difference. I know it's not statistically significant, but it would help me to see whether the covariates are balanced in terms of property characteristics as well. The thing that you worry about is somehow they are choosing to award these credits to people with more dilapidated properties. And I mean, I know they claim that it's a lottery, but just sort of to assuage the reader of any concerns. The second comment is was kind of brought up during the talk already, which is, should we worry about serial correlation, right? So the main specification regresses whether you applied for a permit within t plus tau years. Tau is the window in which you're looking, right? And you're regressing it on whether you were approved in year t, okay? And so my question was the same as Gary's. If some projects apply again in year t plus 1 or t plus 2, if they're denied in year t, then their future approval would be correlated with this error term that you have in the regression, right? So my question was, how often does this happen and how is it handled? And you went into some of that during the talk already. So I would encourage you to at least make a mention of that in the paper. Another concern I had with the spillovers is that in the study of the spillover effects, what they do is they look at the assessed values of neighboring properties, and they're regressing that on whether a focal property was approved for a tax credit. And the paper acknowledges this, but the problem here is that if a property was approved and then renovated and then sold, that could directly affect the assessed value of the neighboring properties, because the assessors may use comps in their assessments, right? And so I think as a robustness check, maybe you can try restricting the sample to the neighboring properties of homes that were renovated but did not sell, right? I think a related point to this that I thought of but didn't make it into the slides is, you know, this suggests that the stable unit treatment value assumption may not be satisfied, right? Saying that the treatment may actually have effect on untreated units through spillover effects. Given that you're finding highly localized spillovers, I'm not super concerned about that, but you could also try a robustness check where in your control group, you drop out properties that are very close to sites that applied for the tax credit. Okay, and then just in terms of bigger picture and things to explore, I'd be really interested for you to look at whether there's a different effect between just having one house that gets improved versus clusters of improvements, right? And so there might be important nonlinearities and interactions. Is there an extra effect of having multiple projects that are renovated on the same street versus just one? I think with your data you could potentially do this, although like I said, small sample sizes may become an issue here. And the other thing is I would really have liked to see an exploration of some longer run effects. I think there's potentially an interaction with gentrification. If, for example, these renovated properties are the first to sell to a higher income household, and they're sort of the first ones that move in, it would be interesting to see what's going on with population dynamics in areas that had more or less of these subsidized housing investments. And I was also wondering, due to the small numbers, this is actually an advantage of small numbers. It sounds like this lottery can actually give meaningful exogenous variation at the neighborhood level, right? Because having one or two tax credits approved at the neighborhood level can actually make a difference. And finally, in terms of the sample sizes and just external validity in general, I definitely encourage you to collect data for the whole state. So this program was for the entire state. And so you could do a lot more if you just got property data on the entire state of Missouri. And finally, bigger picture, I think it's worth mentioning that when I was reading this, I was thinking, you know, can these small investments actually reduce the ability to do larger scale redevelopments? So we know from evidence of like, you know, the San Francisco fire and the Boston fire that having this large scale destruction, which lets you kind of redevelop the area as a whole, can have very positive long run effects. And in terms of, you know, the question of whether housing investment has positive spillovers, right? It's not just a question of whether one house gets, you know, reinvested in. It could be neighborhoods as a whole, and this is related to the clustering thing as well. And so I would definitely encourage you to think along those terms as well. Like maybe it's not that housing investment doesn't work, but we have to rethink how we do it, right? Like these individual randomly assigned may not be the best idea, but maybe some more targeted groups and clustering of reinvestments would be more effective. So that's all my comments. Thank you.